Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And this time, um, we are really going to unpack something that I think we all kind of maybe struggle with and maybe even put on a pedestal,
Yeah.
the idea of genius.
Oh, yeah.
And, are these people
Uh-huh.
really just touched by the divine?
Mm,
Or what is it about these people?
yeah.
And we're going to really look at those big aha moments in history
Yeah,
and,
yeah,
and try to see if we can
yeah.
kind of figure out
Yeah.
what's really going on there. So,
Well, and you know what's
mm,
what's fascinating about the way that we
yeah.
view genius is this idea of what we call the Amadeus myth.
Okay.
And it's this idea that, geniuses, they're qualitatively different from us.
Right.
They're touched by the divine, and they produce these perfect works effortlessly in a sudden flash of insight.
Okay, so when we think about like
Yes.
Einstein's dream, right, writing Game of Light,
Right.
doesn't that just sound mystical?
Right.
I mean, who just dreams up the theory of relativity?
Right. It does sound mystical. But, in a talk he gave called How I Created the Theory of Relativity,
Okay.
Einstein actually dispelled some of that mystery.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So it turns out
Okay.
he was actually immersed in this very specific problem for years,
Uh,
the optical properties of moving bodies.
okay.
So that beam of light dream wasn't really this like sudden epiphany. It was
Yeah.
more like a symbolic representation of years of intense thought.
Okay, so the dream wasn't like the source of the theory.
Yeah.
It was more like after all this mental work, it was like,
Yeah, it was an outcome.
yeah, an outcome.
Yeah, and what's interesting is he specifically mentions the Michelson-Morley experiment
Mm-hmm.
in this talk, and they were actually trying to detect something called luminiferous ether, which they thought light traveled through.
Ah, the ether. The
Yeah,
mysterious substance that turned out not to exist. So
exactly.
he was really working within that existing framework,
It
trying to
was.
make all the pieces fit.
And he was also really heavily influenced by the work of Hendrik Lorentz, who was developing these mathematical transformations to explain how moving objects behaved.
Uh-huh.
So, Einstein really struggled with these transformations, especially when it came to the speed of light.
Yeah.
And he even said, I tried to adapt Lorentz's theory, but I felt very strongly that it was a makeshift solution.
Okay. But if he was struggling with this and building off the work of other people, then how did the aha actually happen?
So it was actually during a conversation with his friend Michel Besso. And
Okay.
he said, we discussed every aspect of this problem. Then suddenly I understood where the key to this problem lay.
Hmm.
And then the very next day he told Besso, thank you, I've completely solved the problem.
So even his big breakthrough came through collaborating and
Yeah.
talking through these ideas.
Exactly.
That makes genius seem a little more accessible, don't you think?
It really does.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is that the key for Einstein was really understanding the nature of time. Not some magical equation that just popped into his head.
Right.
It was a fundamental shift in perspective.
Yeah. Okay, let's test this idea with another story.
Okay.
August Kekulé and his vision of a snake biting its tail that's supposed to have revealed the structure of benzene.
Right. That's another one of those that just seems straight out of the mystical textbook.
Yeah.
But, it turns out that Kekulé himself actually said he was probably in a state of half sleep or daydreaming
Oh.
when this happened. Not a deep dream.
Oh, so not a literal dream, but more like his mind was kind of
Right.
playing with this imagery.
Yeah, playing with this image.
Okay, but why a snake?
Well, think about it.
Yeah.
Snakes biting their tails are a very common motif in mythology,
Uh-huh.
and they often symbolize cycles and interconnectedness.
Yeah.
And Kekulé was trying to figure out how carbon atoms could bond together in this stable ring.
Right.
So the snake biting its tail is like a perfect...
It's a perfect metaphor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It wasn't just some random vision, It was an analogy that helped him connect the unknown, the benzene structure, to something known.
Yeah.
It highlights this power of using what we know to make sense of what we don't.
Okay, let's try another one.
Okay.
Darwin and his finches. Right. Everyone learns how these birds on the Galapagos Islands just sparked his theory of evolution.
And that's actually a big misconception.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Darwin didn't even fully understand the significance of the finches until after he had already formulated his theory of natural selection.
Wait, seriously? So the finches weren't like the trigger
No.
for his aha moment?
Nope.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so Darwin was already thinking about variation and adaptation.
Okay.
And that framework then allowed him to see the pattern in the finch's beak shapes. So it really shows how much our existing knowledge shapes what we observe.
So you're saying you almost need the framework in place
Yeah.
to even recognize a groundbreaking discovery.
Precisely. And you know that aha moment comes when the right framework clicks into place, but that click
Right.
is often the result of a lot of background work.
Wow. Okay, one last aha moment for this round.
Uh-huh.
Alfred Russell Wallace,
Uh-huh.
um, he comes up with a theory of natural selection around the same time as Darwin.
Right.
While delirious with malaria. Sounds pretty dramatic.
Yeah, it definitely makes for a good story.
It does.
But, Wallace had actually been meticulously studying species for years in the Amazon and the Malay archipelago,
Okay.
and he was already grappling with how species change over time.
So it's not like the malaria just gave him the answer?
Right.
His mind was already primed.
Exactly. His mind was primed and ready for that breakthrough.
Yeah.
And it's possible, the fever, by altering his mental state,
Uh-huh.
it might help him make a connection he might not have otherwise made.
Right.
But he was already deeply immersed in the problem.
Okay, so we've debunked some of these myths around these big aha moments.
Yeah.
So are you saying they're not real?
Not at all. They're absolutely real and powerful.
Yeah.
But what we're seeing is that they are the culmination of hard work, dedication, and deep immersion in a subject.
Yeah.
And they're not a substitute for the hard work.
So those moments of inspiration are more like the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
And there's this massive amount of effort and groundwork beneath the surface.
Exactly. And, by understanding those unseen efforts, we actually get a much richer and honestly more inspiring understanding of what genius really is.
Absolutely. And that's what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive.
Yes.
We'll dig into the habits and practices that contribute to those incredible achievements.
Yeah.
Stay tuned. So we've seen that these big aha moments, they aren't quite as magical as they seem.
Yeah.
Right? There's a lot of hard work and preparation behind them.
Yeah.
But what about the people who have these moments? Is there something special about them?
Right.
Are there things we can learn from them?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Can we actually cultivate genius, or are we just kind of stuck with whatever we're born with?
Right.
So, let's take a look at Charles Darwin.
Right.
He's actually a really great example because he didn't fit that stereotype of, the brilliant child prodigy.
Yeah, Darwin himself even said, "I have no great quickness of apprehension or wit. My power to follow a long and purely abstract train of thought is very limited." Doesn't really sound like a typical genius, does it?
Not at all. But, author and skeptic Michael Shermer points out that Darwin actually had some key traits and practices that really contributed to his success.
Okay, like what?
Well, one was his willingness to challenge authority.
Okay.
He understood the existing theory of special creation, but he wasn't afraid to question it.
So it's not about just blindly rebelling. It's about understanding what's there, but then also having that courage to say, hey, maybe this isn't quite right.
Exactly. And, while he was challenging the status quo, Darwin was also incredibly meticulous. He paid very close attention to negative evidence, even dedicating a whole chapter in Origin of Species to difficulties on theory.
So he actively looked for holes in his own ideas.
He did.
That's pretty impressive.
Yeah. And by anticipating and addressing those potential criticisms, he actually strengthened his theory.
Oh, wow.
He wasn't trying to just prove himself right. He was genuinely seeking the truth.
And that probably made him more open to collaborating with others, too, right?
Absolutely.
Like he wasn't afraid of different perspectives.
Yeah, Shermer emphasizes Darwin's massive correspondence.
Okay.
He wrote over 14,000 letters filled with scientific discussions and questions.
Wow.
He was constantly engaging with other thinkers, learning from them, and refining his ideas.
So it wasn't just him alone in his study.
Yeah.
It was this whole...
He was part of a network of knowledge.
Yeah, maybe genius is not just an individual trait, but it's also the community that supports that individual.
That's a great point. And, that actually connects to a fascinating idea from Frank Sullivan, a social scientist who studied Darwin.
Okay.
And he found that Darwin was able to hold what he called this essential tension between respecting tradition and pushing for change.
So he saw the value in what came before, but he wasn't afraid to break new ground.
Exactly. And Sullivan said that most people tend to lean one way or the other, either clinging to tradition or just wanting to overthrow it completely.
Right.
But Darwin was really able to embrace both.
Okay, this is all really interesting, but can we get a little practical here?
Yeah.
What can we do
Yeah.
to cultivate some of these genius-boosting habits?
Well, Shermer gives us a few actionable steps.
Okay.
First, focus on solvable problems.
Oh,
Don't get bogged down in questions that are currently beyond our reach.
right.
He also emphasizes deep knowledge and practice.
Okay.
It's like that old saying, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice.
Oh, love that.
So no shortcuts, just good old-fashioned hard work. Second challenge, assumptions. Think outside the box and embrace criticism, but stay independent in your thinking.
So cultivate that healthy skepticism.
Yes.
But also be open to feedback and refining your ideas.
Exactly.
along the way. And finally, communicate your ideas, share them with others, get feedback,
Yeah.
and keep refining. Genius thrives in a community,
Yeah.
not in isolation.
So it's not just passively absorbing information, it's actively engaging with it, testing it, shaping it
Yes.
through discussion and all that.
That's the key. And, remember, these steps don't guarantee that you'll become the next Darwin,
Right.
but they offer a path to maximize your own potential.
I like that it's not about reaching some mythical level of genius. It's about just becoming the best, most creative
Yes,
version of ourselves.
absolutely. And that journey is unique for each person.
Yeah.
So, now let's actually look at another really fascinating case.
Right.
The story of Darwin and Wallace.
Okay.
It's a tale of co-discovery, potential rivalry, and ultimately a really unique collaboration. Ooh, this is where it gets juicy.
Yeah.
So Wallace was off exploring the world while Darwin was kind of working away in England, right?
Yes. Wallace spent 8 years in the Malay archipelago,
Okay.
collecting over 125,000 specimens and studying species variation,
Oh. Well,
all while dealing with hardship, illness, even malaria.
talk about dedication. And wasn't it during one of those bouts with malaria that he had his breakthrough about natural selection?
That's right.
What?
While he was battling a fever,
Uh,
the idea hit him that, environmental pressures would naturally select the individuals best suited to survive and reproduce.
so his illness, in a way, contributed to his scientific insight. That's wild.
It is. It shows how even these unexpected events can play a role in discovery.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
Wallace sends this essay outlining his theory
Uh-huh.
directly to Darwin.
Wow, talk about putting yourself out there.
I know.
Especially to somebody that's been working on this topic for years. What was Darwin's reaction?
Well, imagine you've been developing this groundbreaking theory for like 2 decades.
Right.
And then suddenly, this young naturalist sends you an essay with strikingly similar ideas.
Yeah.
It must have been quite a shock.
There's also this whole mystery surrounding a missing letter,
Right.
right? Did Darwin actually receive Wallace's essay earlier than he claimed?
Right.
Some people think he might have delayed announcing Wallace's work to give himself time to publish first.
Yeah, and some people, like journalist Arnold Brackman, have even accused Darwin of plagiarizing Wallace's work. But, there's no concrete evidence to support those claims.
Okay.
That missing letter has never been found.
So we're kind of in this historical mystery here.
Yeah.
But what we do have are the letters between Darwin and Wallace.
Right.
And they actually seem to paint a picture of mutual respect and generosity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They genuinely appreciated each other's work and really saw the value in their shared pursuit of understanding evolution.
This reminds me of what we were saying earlier about how genius can thrive through collaboration.
Yeah.
Even when there's potential competition,
Yeah.
they kind of chose to work together.
It's a great example of what's called the plus-sum model.
Okay.
Their games were actually interconnected.
Yeah.
Both actually benefited from that exchange of ideas and the validation of their independent discoveries.
So they were more like teammates than rivals.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's important to note that their theories weren't identical.
Right.
They actually had different emphases and arguments, which actually enriched the overall understanding of evolution.
I'm loving this idea that collaboration beats competition even in science.
It's a powerful concept.
Yeah.
So are you ready for a little scientific detective story with a bit of a twist?
Always up for a good mystery. What's the case?
This one takes us back to the early 20th century,
Okay.
when the search for the missing link in human evolution was really at its peak.
Okay.
In 1912, this seemingly groundbreaking discovery was made in England.
Okay.
Piltdown Man.
Piltdown Man.
Ugh.
That rings a bell.
Yeah.
Wasn't that the supposed missing link that turned out to be a fake?
You got it. But before we get to the big reveal, let's set the stage.
Okay.
So picture this. A skull is found seemingly ancient with a large brain case, but an ape-like jaw.
And found in England, no less. Finally, the British had their own
I know.
ancestor to brag about.
Exactly. And, it seemed to confirm this popular belief at the time that human evolution was driven by the development of large brains first.
So again, we see how our preconceived notions can shape how we interpret evidence.
Absolutely. Scientists are just as susceptible to bias as anyone else.
Right.
They wanted to believe this narrative, and Piltdown Man seemed to fit perfectly.
But how did they not realize it was a fake? I mean, scientists are trained to be
Yeah.
skeptical.
Well, it was actually a very cleverly crafted hoax.
Okay.
The jaw was stained, the teeth were filed down, even tools were planted to create this very convincing story.
Somebody went to a lot of trouble to pull this off.
They did.
But why? Who would do such a thing?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
The prime suspect is Charles Dawson,
No.
the amateur archaeologist who, quote-unquote, discovered the skull.
Right.
But others have been implicated as well.
Like who? Give me the suspects.
Okay, well, there's Teilhard de Chardin, a Jesuit priest and paleontologist. Some even suspect Arthur Conan Doyle.
Well, the creator of Sherlock Holmes might have been behind a real-life scientific hoax?
It's possible.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
But did they ever figure out who actually did it?
Unfortunately, no.
Oh.
There's no conclusive proof to definitively pin it on anyone.
Mm-hmm.
So the case of Piltdown Man remains a mystery.
So even with all of our scientific tools and methods,
Yeah.
some mysteries remain unsolved?
They do, but the real lesson of Piltdown Man isn't about solving this whodunit.
Okay.
It's about understanding how science works.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What can we learn from this whole debacle?
Well, it shows that science is messy.
Okay.
Bias exists, and even the brightest minds can be fooled. But here's the crucial part. The hoax was actually eventually exposed by scientists using new dating techniques.
So the same system that allowed the hoax to flourish also led to its downfall.
Exactly. Science is self-correcting.
Right.
Its ability to question, re-examine, and revise its own conclusions is what makes it so powerful.
Yeah.
And in the case of evolution, Piltdown Man was just one data point,
Right.
eventually outweighed by a mountain of other evidence supporting the theory.
That makes sense. So we shouldn't see this as a failure of science,
Right.
but as proof of its ability to learn and adapt.
Exactly. And, it reminds us to be critical thinkers, to
Yeah.
question assumptions,
Yeah.
and to be wary of narratives that seem a little too perfect.
All right, let's bring it back to genius before we wrap up.
Okay.
I'm feeling like the Amadeus myth is officially busted.
I think it's safe to say that, that romantic notion of effortless genius is just that,
Yeah.
a romantic notion.
It makes for a good story,
Yeah.
but reality is much more complex and interesting.
I agree. And, while there might not be a simple formula for genius,
Right.
we've seen that there are traits and practices that can nurture creative potential.
So it's not about waiting for inspiration to strike. It's about creating the conditions for those sparks to fly.
Exactly. And those sparks can come from anywhere.
Yeah.
Collaboration, hard work,
Yeah.
even a bout of malaria.
Well, that's quite a thought. But before we go any further down that road, we need to address the elephant in the room.
Okay.
The ultimate Amadeus myth, Mozart.
Yes.
Was he truly touched by divine inspiration? Or is there more to the story? Let's find out in the final part of our deep dive. Okay, so we're back, and I think it's time to address the elephant in the room, the ultimate Amadeus myth, Mozart.
Yeah.
Was he truly just this divine conduit for music? Or was there something else going on behind those incredible compositions?
Well, Mozart is really fascinating because, his music is undeniably brilliant.
Right.
It's complex, it's beautiful, it seems to flow so effortlessly. And it's easy to see why people would latch onto this idea of divine inspiration.
The guy was composing minuets when he was 6 years old.
Right.
That doesn't really scream normal human development to me.
It's pretty remarkable.
How do you even explain that?
It is remarkable. But, Mozart actually offered some clues about his process in his letters.
Oh, okay.
He talked about these musical thoughts coming to him seemingly out of nowhere while he was taking a walk or after a meal or even in the middle of the night. And he said, he would keep these melodies in his head, humming them to himself until he could write them down.
Isn't that kind of how a lot of creative people work, though?
Yeah.
Ideas pop up and then you kind of play with them and see what takes shape.
Exactly. And, it's that same process of variation and selection we've been talking about.
Right.
Mozart wasn't just passively receiving these perfect compositions from some higher power.
Right.
He was actively engaging with his musical ideas, choosing the ones that resonated with him and discarding the rest.
So even Mozart had to edit his work. No first draft masterpieces.
It seems not. You know, while there are stories about him composing entire pieces in his head,
Right.
his notebooks actually tell a different story.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they're actually filled with fragments, revisions, even unfinished works.
It makes him seem a lot more human, right?
Yeah.
Like he wasn't just this flawless musical machine.
Right.
He struggled, he experimented,
Yeah,
revised, just like any other artist.
exactly. And, you know, let's not forget, Mozart wasn't composing in a vacuum either.
Right.
He was influenced by, you know, the musical traditions and styles of his time.
Right.
Musicologist R. Baker even found that a significant portion of Mozart's melodies actually have echoes in the works of his contemporaries.
So like any artist, he was building on what came before him, taking inspiration from others and adding his own unique twist.
Precisely. And we can't underestimate the influence of his father, Leopold.
Oh, yeah.
You know, he was a composer himself and really started young Wolfgang on this very rigorous musical education from a very early age.
So it wasn't just raw talent.
Hmm.
There was structured discipline, years of dedicated practice.
Absolutely. And I think that's where the real takeaway lies.
Yeah.
You know, Mozart's genius wasn't simply about innate ability.
Yeah.
It was cultivated through years of dedication, discipline, and immersion in the world of music.
I feel like this is the pattern that we've been seeing throughout our deep dive, right?
Yeah.
It's not about being born a genius. It's about that commitment to a craft, the honing of skills, this relentless pursuit of mastery. It's almost like genius is a verb, not a noun.
I love that. You know, genius is a process. It's an action. It's a constant striving.
Yeah.
And remember, even Mozart had to start somewhere. He wasn't born composing symphonies.
Yeah.
He had to learn the basics. He had to practice scales. He had to study the works of other composers.
There's hope for us mere mortals yet.
Absolutely.
Maybe we can all tap into our own inner Mozart, even if it's not composing symphonies.
Exactly. Not everyone will become a Mozart, but we can all strive for excellence in our chosen pursuits. And, you know, by understanding the true nature of genius, we can shed those limiting beliefs about innate talent and really embrace the power of hard work, dedication, and this willingness to constantly learn and grow.
I love that. So instead of getting caught up in the Amadeus myth, we should be focusing on what you might call the Amadeus method.
Yeah.
What can we learn from these creative giants?
Right.
How can we apply those lessons to our own lives?
That's a perfect question for our listeners to ponder. You know, what Amadeus myths are you holding on to?
Right.
Are there areas where you're underestimating the power of dedication and practice?
What if instead of thinking, I'm not a genius, I could never do that,
Right.
you thought, what would it take for me to get really good at this?
Yeah.
What skills could I develop? Who could I learn from?
That shift in perspective can be so empowering.
Right.
And remember, you know, genius isn't about magical abilities. It's about pushing the boundaries of what's humanly possible.
Yeah.
And that journey starts with, you know, a commitment to growth, a willingness to learn, and that dedication to putting in the work even when it's tough.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into genius. Thanks for joining us as we debunked myths, uncovered hidden truths, and hopefully sparked some inspiration along the way. Until next time, keep those Amadeus methods in mind and see where they take you.